Howdy, everyone. Howdy. Oh, come on. Give me a good, proper howdy. Howdy! Whoa. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you for coming. I'd like to welcome you to our annual Spring Education Policy Series workshop. So this event is being sponsored by the Moshbacher Institute. So my name is Dr. Colena Cortez. I'm an associate professor here at the Bush School, and I'll be introducing our speaker for today. But first, I'd like to give you some background on our Ed Policy series. So this series started in 2016 with the purpose to bring in prominent scholars who are working on timely education and policy relevant topics. So our previous speakers include Doug Harris from Tulane University, Amy Ellen Schwartz from Syracuse University, Susanna Lowe from Brown, and last year we had the honor of hosting Sue Donarski from University of Michigan. So today we're absolutely thrilled to bring to you Dr. Thomas Dee. So Tom holds the Barnett Family Professorship of Education at Stanford's Graduate School of Education. He's a senior fellow at Stanford's Institute for Economic Policy and Research, and also directs the John Gardner Center for Youth and Their Communities at Stanford. Throughout Tom's career, he has studied many topics related to education policy, such as competition between private and public schools, school finance, school reform, and high-stakes testing and teacher incentives. As an example of Tom's amazing ed policy work, he pioneered the research on the impact of demographic similarity between students and teachers. Tom has also successfully researched the impact of the No Child Left Behind Act and its emphasis on test-based school accountability on students, teachers, and schools. So without further ado, please help me welcome Tom Dee to the stage, and let's give Tom a really warm Aggieland welcome.
Thank you so much, folks. It's a pleasure to be here, and I've really enjoyed your hospitality today, and I'm really glad to be speaking with you this evening, or late afternoon, shall we say. So I'm going to be talking today about this working paper called My Brother's Keeper, the Impact of Targeted Educational Supports, and this is joint work with Professor Emily Penner at UC Irvine, and Emily was a postdoc in our Ed Policy group at Stanford. And the fundamental focus of today's talk is going to be quasi-experimental evidence on the impact of a really unique program, the African American Male Achievement Program. And the AAMA self-describes as an ambitious project designed to dramatically improve academic and ultimately life outcomes for African American male students in Oakland. And this is work done to some degree in partnership with folks in the district. And I'm going to want to talk a little bit about the researcher-practitioner partnership nature of this. But just so you know the roadmap for some of the main results, I wanted to give you a sense of the main findings. So first of all, the core results are quasi-experimental evidence based on the scale-up of the program across schools, grades, and time. And so we leverage that to try to get purchase on the causal impact of the program. And we focus in particular on what are called event dropouts. We observe in a school grade year cell how many kids who were enrolled in that year were enrolled nowhere in the state in the subsequent year. And these event dropouts really matter. Like some of those kids may return and maybe even eventually graduate from high school, but the probability is lamentably low. Most of the kids who drop out as event dropouts never become conventional high school graduates. So what we find is that access to the program led to a substantial reduction in dropout counts among black males. That's at least 19%. And I'm going to talk some of these percentage changes sound large, but I'll talk about the kind of face validity of those impact estimates as we get into it. I also see suggestive evidence that I'm going to argue is consistent, particularly with some of the social psychological theory that I think is behind the program design, that these gains are really concentrated in grade 9, that what's sometimes called the make or break year of high school, that kind of propitious, vexed moment when kids are transitioning to the high school environment. And we also see evidence of smaller spillover effects, reductions in dropout risk for black females. Okay, so what's the motivation motivation for this talk? Well, one rather obvious one is the persistently underrealized potential of black males in Oakland and elsewhere, where we see comparatively high rates of suspensions, chronic absenteeism, persistently low achievement and educational attainment. But for me, what makes this project so exciting is some of the broader conceptual motivation. And so I really want to take some time to unpackage this. I view this study as contributing in 5 specific ways to broader issues around the theory, policy, and practice relevant to the pursuit of educational equity. And so it's that broader context that makes this so exciting for me. The quasi-experimental work is pretty straightforward, no bells and whistles that usually excite economists. Maybe a little bit of the triple difference design and some randomization inference. There's a few methodological grace notes, but it's just pretty much a straightforward program evaluation, and it's where it sits conceptually in a couple of different ways that I think makes this so interesting. So let me unpackage these 5 distinct motivations. The first is my brother's keeper. So as many of you may know, Obama began in 2014 a kind of public-private partnership to address persistent opportunity gaps facing boys and young men of color. It began under the aegis of a second administration, but continues through the work of the Obama Foundation. And it's interesting, I was talking with ed policy students yesterday about the role of modern philanthropy in democratic governance, and we discussed the Gates Foundation, Walton, the Broad Foundation. The work of the Obama Foundation, I think, has kind of not face some of the critical scrutiny that other foundation activity in ed policy has. So this is a prominent initiative, and what it does is they will engage with communities and encourage them to articulate particular performance metrics for young men of color, including things like high school graduation, the focal point of our study today. And the financial investments and the scale of this are really non-trivial. So the Obama Foundation has directed engagement with 250 communities around the US, and that's involved roughly $1 billion in low-interest finance for these initiatives, as well as $600 million in grants, both cash and in-kind transfers. So a really substantial, large-scale effort. And Oakland participates in the My Brother's Keeper Community Challenge and prominently features the AAMA program as part of its initiative. These initiatives are quite new, and we don't really, to my knowledge, have any evidence on them yet. So motivation 1 is this is leading evidence on the impact associated with this prominent philanthropic initiative. Okay, motivation 2 has to do with an unusual conceptual background that undergirds programs like My Brother's Keeper, referred to as targeted universalism. And I'll confess, I've been working in education policy, often with an equity focus, for longer than I care to admit. And this is something that I hadn't really heard of before, because it's largely a concept that's developed in advocacy circles. And targeted universalism is basically both a policy design and a political economy concept. And it emphasizes the idea of achieving universal goals, but doing them through targeted approaches. And it's most commonly associated with the work of John Powell, who's a scholar activist at Berkeley. And the basic idea is that he would argue that the most effective social policy programs are often ones that are targeted to the bespoke needs of the particular subpopulation you're trying to help. But often those targeted programs lack political durability. They're vulnerable in certain ways. So a classic example might be affirmative action, right? It targets support, but it runs into sort of political and other normative challenges that threaten its durability. So what John Powell envisions is a world where we have first broad discussions of what are the universal goals we may have for all kids, and where are certain subgroups with regard to meeting those goals. And then using that as a foundation for then saying, how can we develop sort of targeted strategies for supporting them? In many ways, it becomes kind of a direct challenge to how we commonly think about diversity in the US. And I think that's part of what makes this kind of a striking conceptual frame. And targeted universalism will also argue that there are prominent externalities associated with this approach, and they will refer to that as the curb cut effect. And this is motivated by thinking of things like the American with Disabilities Act as an example of targeted universalism. Our universal goal may be, regardless of someone's physical capacity, they're entitled to be able to move through our society. Okay? Well, different groups are going to have different capacities to do that. We need to support them through targeted means, and one common example of this is curb cuts and sidewalks. And I and others in the room are probably old enough to remember when they were not the norm, and it was after the American with Disabilities Act that they began to become more pervasive. So they arguably had their intended effect, but advocates of targeted universalism will also argue they generate spillover benefits, because all of us who ever had a rolling suitcase or a stroller or a dolly began to appreciate those curb cuts as well. I sometimes joke that the ascent of electric scooters has complicated that concept, because many of us maybe don't appreciate them on the sidewalks, and the curb cuts are helping with that. But anyway, OUSD, the Oakland Unified School District, specifically grounds their motivation for the African American Male Achievement Program as targeted universalism. And another part of this is the idea of adopting a targeted approach, refining it and establishing it as a proof point to expand such program to other groups. And again, when we have an idea of e pluribus unum as part of our national identity, these kinds of targeted approaches kind of complicate our understanding and challenge our understanding of that. So, but OUSD has followed through with this idea that the AAMA was kind of a proof point for other programs. To be honest, I think they may have also been compelled to do so by Title IX attention from the government, like, why are you focusing on young men of color and not other groups? But I can just show you some screenshots from their website and news articles that talk about, having programs on African American female excellence, programs focused on Latinx students, and it's been getting attention in news articles as well. So another second motivation for this program is this idea of targeted universalism. Prominent in activist circles has not really been discussed in policy design circles, and I think merits some consideration. And this empirical work speaks to some extent to their theory of change. Okay. Third motivation is the broader policy context, education policy context around equity right now. And I would argue that we're now in a posture where there's been kind of a policy retreat from equity, right? In particular, the accountability requirements that the federal government had articulated under No Child Left Behind have largely been rolled back under its reauthorization as the Every Student Succeeds Act. Now, it is true that under ESSA, as we call it in ed policy, testing and SEL, social emotional learning measurement, are entrenched, but some of the the centrist political coalition that supported No Child Left Behind has fallen victim to broader partisan polarization, and that has resulted in an accountability reform that some people have characterized as a paper tiger. And indeed, prominent civil rights groups have criticized the U.S. Department of Education, saying, like, look, you're not holding states to the letter of the law here. There's a reduced emphasis on subgroup accountability. For those of you familiar with No Child Left Behind, you may recollect it particularly asked schools to bring all of their students up to our expectations and ding them if they didn't. They were deemed to be failing to make adequate yearly progress. That has largely, not in every state, but has been defanged to some extent. And we still have a lot to learn about ESSA, but a lot of the differentiated accountability that exists now in federal education policy is like what we saw under this kind of interregnum period between NCLB and ESSA, when the Secretary of Education began issuing waivers to states, and states began introducing targeted school reforms called focus school reforms that were meant to address achievement gaps in schools that had particular challenges on those metrics. Most of the evidence is that they were ineffective, and a lot of states seem to be engaging in what I like to call cosmetic regulatory compliance rather than deep change that was meant to improve school performance. Though I will note one study led by Sharday Bonilla, finds positive effects in Kentucky, where they had a very activist state government and really seemed to be doing ambitious things, implementing teacher professional development, for example, that teachers seem to really value. But I think there's broad reason for skepticism. Okay, so why does this matter for the AAMA? Well, we're in a period that Mike Petrilli at the Fordham Foundation has characterized as the end of education policy. He was sort of playing off that old Francis Fukuyama book, The End of History, you may remember from years ago. And of course, education policy hasn't ended. I think the point is we've seen kind of a high watermark for ambitious, prescriptive federal education policy, and there's been this devolution to states. But as part of that, we're entering, I guess Mike has a taste for purple rhetoric. He refers, we're now entering this sort of golden age of educational practice, because as those high-level federal reforms have become less prominent, there's an increasing focus on local innovation as a way to think of sort of prominent ideas for pushing educational equity forward. And this gets particularly instantiated in what we call researcher-practitioner partnerships that are very prominent at Stanford and elsewhere, and you have great examples here at Texas A&M of that. I'm thinking in particular of Professor Cortez's Text for Teen program. This idea of partnering with regional school districts to develop leading innovations and assess them rigorously is really a rich opportunity because it builds capacity with policy practitioners, it allows researchers to learn new things from those practitioners, and allows researchers to examine innovation that contributes to generalizable knowledge for the field. So I would argue the AMA has that kind of motivation. It's as a local leading innovation. It has something to potentially contribute to the broader national dialogue. Okay, so that was motivation 3. Let's move to motivation 4, which is there's a growing interest in high quality curricula as low-hanging fruit in terms of educational policy. Right, the idea there are certain curricula that RCTs suggest work substantially better, so the idea is just getting teachers to use those curricula might be an easy, low-cost way to drive school improvement. And I thought it was interesting. Russ Whitehurst was the inaugural director of the Institute for Education Sciences, which is sort of like the NIH of education. And when he stepped down from his position, I thought it was interesting. He moved to Brookings, and the very first thing he wrote was, we need to pay attention to curriculum. He had been funding all of these RCTs and found that, often just by getting teachers to switch to a better math or reading curriculum, you could generate big improvements. Now, part of the issue with this, though, is that those experimental studies were done under quite rarefied, well-financed conditions, where the teachers had incredible support, they had fidelity to the curriculum. These were large, multi-million-dollar evaluation initiatives. And there's a recent study by David Blazier, Tom Kane, and a cast of thousands. It's one of the many authors on that paper. It's available at the Harvard Ed Policy Center. They did a quasi-experimental study and found that you don't necessarily see the same results if you look at it in situ, in the field, because what happens is outside the rarefied supported structure of an RCT, teacher fidelity to the curriculum isn't necessarily that great. And this is pretty well known by those of us who work in ed policy. We commonly refer to teachers as street-level bureaucrats, who close their classroom doors and have some autonomy. And so there's interest in curriculum, but there's also concern about, does it work in when you're actually out in the field? And this is one of the reasons I love RCTs, and I do RCTs. They play an important role in our system of knowledge. But I think one of the problems is sometimes what you learn from an RCT is like cultivating a hothouse orchid. You learn what helps that plant thrive in a rarefied control environment, but it doesn't necessarily tell you what will thrive in field settings, okay? So anyway, the point here is that the AMA has a distinct curricular design, as I'll discuss, and I would argue is coupled with what appears to be reasonably high implementation fidelity, careful teacher training, and support at an increasing scale. Okay, that's motivation 4. So the 5th one has to do with a literature on culturally relevant pedagogy. And this may not be familiar to some people in the audience, but those who work in education are probably very familiar with this. There's an extraordinarily prominent and influential literature in education that is focused on instructional content and teacher practices, what we think of as pedagogy, as an incredibly potent way to unlock the educational potential of historically marginalized students. So what are we talking about here? Well, the context is really like for many historically marginalized students, they experience schools as highly threatening and alienating spaces. Right, where, and that's a kind of environment that can really impugn their motivation to learn. Culturally relevant pedagogy involves giving them in the curriculum cultural references that are aligned with their out-of-school experiences. It involves a culture and classroom practices that affirm their identities. And third, there's often a big emphasis in this literature on fostering critical social engagement to the point of even going further towards actively critiquing oppression. And so this literature is, again, very prominent in education, and it's supported by an enormous corpus of kind of ethnographic, qualitative studies, but that are often based on like small samples. And so though it's been influential, I would also argue it's been marginalized in prominent policy and research communities, and with a dynamic I think many of us understand, because for many of us who are, like myself, who are in traditional social sciences, when we look at this pedagogy and the studies of it, it seems more like social justice than social science. And so it's hard for us to sort of lend much credence if you're in that kind of mindset space. Well, what Professor Penner and I have been arguing, though, is that dichotomy may be a false one, that there appears to be a way to synthesize culturally relevant pedagogy with social scientific frames that we understand well. Moreover, what we've been doing in this work and another study I'll describe is bringing modern causal inference to testing some of the claims that have been made from ethnographic researchers in this space. So let me unpackage that a little bit. I think the connection between culturally relevant pedagogy and some of the exciting things we've been learning from social psychology are particularly on point. Specifically, there's a growing literature that shows that surprisingly brief psychological interventions that do things like, at the beginning of the school year, get you to go through an exercise of affirming your value, of personal values, or that maybe forewarn you about how stereotypes might alienate you in an educational space and to avoid that kind of negative impact. Or psychological interventions that give you external attributions for personal challenges. There'll be exercises like, you're transitioning to 9th grade. That's a famously vexed educational transition for many students. So if you're struggling, that doesn't mean you can't thrive academically in this setting. Instead, it means, it's just you're having a common experience. So external attribution. And finally, there's also recent literature, and all of this is experimental, by the way, on interventions that seek to promote a sense of belongingness in school. And each of these in isolation has shown really compelling promise. Surprisingly brief interventions, low cost, potentially scalable, but also this literature has been roiled with something many of you may be aware of, which is the replication crisis in psychology, right? Like there's good experimental evidence for the efficacy of these interventions, but they don't always seem to be effective. And when you talk to social psychologists about why, they'll say, look, these interventions rely on a felicitous context in order to have an effect. They'll often use these metaphors that frankly I find a little overly facile. They'll say things like, when you throw a light switch and the lights go on, it seems like magic, but know what you had to have in place for that to happen. The outlet needed to work, the power, the wiring, the light bulb, the socket, and if any one weren't in place, throwing the switch would not have had an effect. Or sometimes it's a spark plug or something else. I've been pressing people in this literature maybe to get more specific about the moderators of treatment impact, but basically you need like a felicitous educational context, whatever that might be. Well, so I've been, Emily and I have been arguing in this work that culturally relevant pedagogy is kind of interesting in this space because it resembles an exceptionally intensive and sustained social psych intervention. Because if you were to think about what goes on in culturally relevant pedagogy and what goes on in these interventions, I would argue there's commonality. Culturally relevant pedagogy embeds all of these things, affirming values, the curriculum in them often discusses stereotypes and how they shape my world. Certainly the critical consciousness about understanding the social history of the U.S. could be understood as external attribution for life challenges you may face. And also, giving people a sense of their own potential, growth mindset. And culturally relevant pedagogy doesn't do this for 15 minutes at the beginning of the school year. It does it every day throughout a 180-day school year. So an unusually intensive and sustained social psych intervention, and one that may, because it's shaping the entire classroom environment and not targeted at individual students, may also help create those kind of felicitous contexts that help social psych interventions to take root and have effect through engaging student motivation and learning, okay? So that's one argument that, we tend to think of culturally relevant pedagogy as social justice, but we could, I'm arguing, reconceive it on social scientific grounds. And I want to also do that through the lens of both an emerging economics tradition and a sociological tradition. So we talk a little bit in the paper. There's a growing economics literature led by George Akerlof and Rachel Cranton on identity economics that has been incorporating aspects of social identity into kind of conventional economic models. And we adapt in the paper one of their models to fit this context. And I pulled the equations out just so we could, in the interest of brevity. But the basic model is one where people choose effort to maximize utility, and that includes the conventional specification where you undertake effort because it creates skill and there's a return to skill, but there's also a disutility to effort. But then they add to that social identity term, which I adapted for this context. And basically, what we argue there is it includes some sense of social identity, which is, say you're a black student in a school setting, you understand that you have dignity and worth and intellectual capacity, and that's part of a social identity benefit. But there's also some disutility when your effort starts to diverge from the effort signaled to you by the school about what they expect from you. Okay, and the argument is that programs like the AAMA essentially elevate those expectations, and we could show that increases optimally chosen effort and learning. Now, one of the things that motivated me down this was listening to some of the student voices I'm going to show you in a video, and seeing a connection between that and some seminal work from W.E.B. Du Bois, who's sort of like the father of modern sociology, and his 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folk. One of the key ideas from it was this idea of double consciousness, that he was speaking specifically about African Americans, but it could apply to any sort of historically marginalized group, that they struggle with this burden of knowing their own dignity and self-worth, but also being aware that others may view them through the lens of a negative stereotype. And so I'll show you a quote from his book that describes this. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. The history of the American Negro is the history of this strife. So this is a long-standing, influential idea, and it struck me. I'm going to show you a short 3-minute video in a moment, produced by the students in the AAMA. And one of the students says something like this. They used to see me as a threat, now they see who I really am. So that struck me as consistent with this idea of the AAMA perhaps working by reducing this experience of double consciousness, this evaluative threat, this sense of alienation that marginalized students can sometimes experience in school settings. Okay, is there any empirical evidence for culturally relevant pedagogy? Well, this study is contributing to that, but it also builds on an earlier study Professor Penner and I did using an ethnic studies curriculum in the San Francisco Unified School District. So I just briefly wanted to tell you about that, because as far as I know, these two are the only studies using quasi-experimental techniques to get at these issues. So that earlier study, which was published in 2017, focused on a grade 9 ethnic studies curriculum that San Francisco Unified had been piloting. And we found substantial effects of taking that course on a variety of proximate grade 9 outcomes. We're now in the process, these cohorts have aged enough that we're examining longer term effects. But what's critical here, because I know like when someone tells you, we found this program was amazing. Well, did you really? Was it credible? There's a really nice RD design here that I think has a high degree of causal validity. In particular, we found when we went to talk with the district about their interest in evaluating this, that they targeted the grade 9 ethnic studies curriculum to students who had been struggling in 8th grade. In particular, if a student's core GPA in grade 8 were below 2.0, they encouraged them to take the course. So, and they did this in 3 pilot schools over a couple years. So we had 5 school year cohorts of over 1,400 students. Now there is a caveat here that there's uncertain fidelity, about scaling this up. I want to acknowledge that. But let me show you what we found first on the treatment margin. So many of you may be familiar with graphs like this, but we're basically looking at students on the right as their GPA is centered on 2.0. So these is the average percent of students who took ethnic studies if grade 8 GPA were 2.0 to something like 2.1, and then the next bin. So you see very low take-up of ethnic studies here, and as their grade 8 GPA crosses the threshold, it jumps up about 25 percentage points. So there, around this capricious threshold, there's a sharp discrete increase in take-up of the program. This is a compelling opportunity to do causal inference by asking, do subsequent grade 9 outcomes also show a discrete jump at that threshold? And let me show you what I found, or what we found for the grade 9 GPA. So we could see at that threshold, the scatter plot of grade 9 GPA on grade 8 GPA shows this jump of around 0.4. Now remember, that jump in 0.4 GPA is associated with when you go from a 20 to a 25 percentage point uptake. So if you wanted to ask what's the effect of actually taking ethnic studies, it's going to be this change divided by roughly 0.25. So the implied effect of actually taking the ethnic studies course was to increase GPA by 1.4. And notice what's going on here. Again, students around here were at 2.0 in grade 8. Notice we predict for them in grade 9 a GPA of 1.5. So this is an almost implausibly large effect, but it's basically moving kids from a D to a kind of C+ in the grade distribution. And a host of other robustness checks that discuss that, but I just wanted to present this as kind of early evidence on the and causally credible evidence on the impact of culturally relevant pedagogy. I'll also note, as an aside, this is something we might want to return to in our discussion period. This study had more impact, I think, than almost anything I'd done, because on the basis of this results, the San Francisco School District went to scale with this curriculum, and then in short order, the state began a movement to develop a model ethnic studies curriculum and encourage throughout the sort of 10,000 schools in the state that they take this up. And there's been a kind of interesting political economy about that, because last fall, a state commission released a draft ethnic studies curriculum that turned into a public relations nightmare as people began picking apart, whose history is recognized in this. And there were lots of like opaque language around, like, I think one was a cis-hetero patriarchy that people are just kind of like scratching their heads trying to understand it. So they quickly pulled that curriculum and they're revising it now, and we're going to revisit that. So that's something on which we might want to engage. But let's turn back to the AMA and learning more about this program, because it's quite different from ethnic studies. It's intersectional and intentionally in its design because of that targeted universalism framework. But before I describe the program, I want to talk a little bit about the political economy around it, because I think this is so critical. And often policy innovations that are promising, I'm increasingly thinking we never get to learn about their impact because often they don't survive politically long enough for us to assess them. So the AMA began in 3 Oakland high schools in the 10-11 school year with support from the then superintendent, Tony Smith. He went outside the school district and identified Chris Chapman as someone he hired as the executive director of this newly created initiative. Though Chris was not an Oakland Unified employee. He was in a nonprofit outside the district at this time. Within 2 years, Superintendent Smith stepped down, ostensibly for health reasons. And the new superintendent was not a fan of the AMA. And like many policy innovations, it might have died there. But there was a weird kind of alignment of planets where the AMA actually became instead institutionalized at this point. Chris Chapman became a formal Oakland Unified employee. He's now their chief equity officer. It received dedicated funding and staffing. And as far as I could tell, this is partly due to federal pressure. The My Brother's Keeper initiative was nascent at this point, and that provided some motivation. But even more on point, the district was under investigation by the Office of Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education for the racial bias in exclusionary discipline. And the course is, it's gone under different name changes, but it's generally referred to as the MDP, the Manhood Development Program. And Chris was very purposeful about this not being a pullout program, because part of the theory of change, again, is changing for young men of color their experience of the school environment. And pullout programs don't necessarily do that. They don't change the fabric of everyday school experience. And also I'm going to talk a little bit about cost effectiveness. I think it's important that because this is a college-aligned course that's using OUSD teachers, in many ways its costs are quite low because it's largely a reallocation of extant district resources rather than requiring new resources. Okay, I'll talk about the course a little more, but the AMA also includes some case management support, academic mentoring, personal guidance, looking at transcripts, college and career activities, some leadership and character development activities and field trips. They also emphasize a heterogeneous cohort model where they try intentionally to mix students with higher and lower performing academic results. And it's partly to create peer supports and to foster a sense of community among the students. Now, in terms of the Manhood Development Program, it's in part a kind of longstanding social emotional curriculum. It's based on the 180 Degrees curriculum, but it combines some of that with a focus on African and African American history and an emphasis on critical thinking. The instructors of the Manhood Development Program are carefully selected and trained African American men, typically from Oakland, often younger teachers, and there's a particular emphasis on cultivating various dimensions of culturally relevant pedagogy, not only in the material, but in the way teachers interact with students. And there's a nice book that unpackages this, if you're interested in this, and talks about a kind of pedagogy that, says we dare say love, like that tries to cultivate a culture of care for the students, and that manifests itself in different ways. Like I remember one of the anecdotes from this book was, if a student were acting out in class, the teacher would say, "Give me push-ups," instead of sending them to the principal office. And they would interview the student later, and they said, "Yeah, I was misbehaving, and this teacher cared for me and didn't try to trip me up by sending me to the administration. They kept me in the class and worked with me." And it's not clear so much like what's culturally relevant about that. Maybe it's just good pedagogy. But these are the kinds of narratives that get unpackaged in this book, which I recommend. There are also these kinds of curricular units that blend social emotional learning with different kinds of elements of history, the meaning of life, how do I see myself, life's hard questions, the black male image in American media, units on ancient African civilizations, the struggle for liberation and dignity, the emotional character of manhood, etc. So to give you a little flavor of the character of this program, I want to show you a short 3-minute video that begins with some student voices and ends with a little song they created that'll give you a sense of how striking and unusual, and frankly, for someone like me, a little uncomfortable, this program is. So let me show you this, and then we'll take a hard and awkward pivot to discussing data and causal inference.
I was just walking down my neighborhood like I do every day. Someone walked up to me, asked me, "What gang am I from?" But as I'm looking at him, I see him reaching for something. I immediately put my hands up. I'm not trying to die. So he points it at me. He looks at me, he puts it away, and he keeps walking. I think I dodged a bullet, My days are not promised, so that could have been the end of my life right there. From 6th grade to 8th, I changed a lot. Like, my transformation has been great. My average GPA in 6th grade was a 2.8. Now it's a 3.8, and now I'm on student council. If I didn't have MDP, I don't know where I'd be in life.
They feel like that I'm a threat to them, basically. Like, I'm not going to be handling my business. I'm not going to be a 3.0 student. It changed because they finally know who I really am. They don't really just perceive me as a black male.
It teaches you about being in boyhood to manhood, which is like almost the greatest level. Their actual greatest level is being a king. And it teaches you not to get caught up in the media or the matrix. So when I become a scientist, I want to be a biologist and chemistry scientist, and I want to cure cancer. And maybe after that, cure some more stuff.
Who are you?
I'm a king, and you?
A kingmaker, the AAMA way, live in the bay.
Welcome to a come see what's good.
It's deeper than the class, it's really a brotherhood. Who are you?
I'm a king, and you?
A kingmaker, the AAMA way, live in the bay.
Welcome to our world, come see what's good.
It's deeper than the class, it's really a brotherhood.
Gentlemen, come and take a seat. It's a class where the past of the kingdom makers meet. At the end of the day, it's a space to let us breathe. Let the noise out there motivate to move my feet. Like, go get 'em. Met a couple brothers, we cold chillin'. Talking about the hate they gon' give us this old system. We in here, ain't no victim. How you gonna battle an army alone? Got a tribe full of family, so I'm always at home. And when we separated, only business is shown. And if you hear any noise, it's NDP boys like, oh.
What hood we rep?
Manhood.
What hood we rep?
Manhood.
Clap it up for yourselves.
Who are you?
I'm a king, and you?
A kingmaker, the AAMA way, live in the bay.
Welcome to our world, come see what's good.
It's deeper than the class, it's really a brotherhood.
A brotherhood, a brotherhood.
So one of the things I forgot to mention I think is worth underscoring, when they discuss this idea of a curriculum focused on manhood, I think for me and other observers, like, some caution would go up around, so let's talk about what do you mean by manhood, right? Because you might worry that it might instantiate, some degree of misogyny or homophobia. People I've talked to have said that's not the case, but that seems to be so, but I just wanted to surface that as another potential criticism that might be more salient, perhaps with less thoughtful, careful efforts to replicate and scale. Okay, so that's the bit about the program. Let's take that hard pivot to data. And this was a real challenge. Anyone who's worked in partnership with practitioners, particularly with school districts, knows that data are a mess, and that was certainly so here. District data systems are often siloed in different ways and built for observation or for operations, not for research. So we tried different ways to approach working with the district's own data and just found the quality of it too low. But fortunately, we were able to turn to state data, and particularly for dropouts, the state system has a kind of panoptic view. Like, if a student leaves the Oakland School District, the state knows, has that student shown up anywhere else in the state? No, they're a dropout. So in particular, they report every year enrollment counts, and among the students enrolled, how many dropped out at quite a fine degree of granularity for each school, grade within each school, in a year, and subgroups. So we'll know, and I'll show you an example of the data, but we'll know for a particular high school, for the black males in that grade in a given year, how many were enrolled, how many appeared to drop out based on the state's panoptic view of enrollment in the state. Now, our study has 9 high schools observed over 4 grades and 12 years. There's a little bit of imbalance. One school is only observed in grade 12, and 3 others are unbalanced because they opened up during the study window. We have some checks that look at balance panels and where we get very similar results. But the overall data set is 310 observations from 33 unique school grade clusters. And those of you who are facile with inference and econometrics might worry about a finite sample problem with so few clusters. That's something we engage as well. But this is really all the African American males, or a substantial fraction of them, in Oakland. So this data set represents over 15,000 student year observations of black male high school students. So a lot of our work was just understanding when and where the program became active. So we also gathered data on the staggered scale up of the AMA across these, most of these high schools at the school grade year level. And so we did this through triangulating multiple different resources, published reports, some of the kind of somewhat vexed district data on rosters and transcripts. We particularly went to their internal program archives, what was left after 3 moves and a flood, staffing data, and particularly staff conversations. And so it was particularly helpful in pulling these different data together and sitting down with knowledgeable staff who'd been running this program for years. And in particular, the staffing is what catalyzed high fidelity recollections for them. So we were able to identify when and where the program was active. And just to give you a sense of some of the internal validity threats for causal inference here, sometimes the program was there and then it pulled back. And when I would talk with them about why, they would say, oh, there was a new principal, and the principal wasn't down with the program. Right? Well, that should catalyze, for those of you who think about causal inference, well, maybe there's some unobserved things associated with program adoption that might have an effect. A principal who cares about equity might, welcome this program and do 10 other things. So that's a threat to internal validity that our design is going to try to engage. So anyway, it began in the 10-11 school year, expanded from 3 to 6 high schools out of the 9 in different school grade year cells, but really concentrated in grades 9 and 10. Okay, let me give you a sense again of the data. So this is the kind of data we could get from the state. Oakland Tech was one of the original adopting high schools. As a bit of an aside, I learned a lot about Oakland Tech. This is where Clint Eastwood went to high school, which I thought was kind of interesting. And if there are any seam heads out there, baseball fans, you may know who holds the MLB record for stolen bases. Does anyone know? Ricky Henderson, class of '76 at Oakland Tech. So anyway, this is the kind of data the state have. And so our window begins in 2005. They'll tell us, okay, in grade 9 for this black male subgroup, there were 172 kids enrolled. 19 of them appeared to drop out, an event dropout, as we look to the subsequent fall. And this is a period above the red line where the AMA program wasn't active. And notice, like, there's some noise in a year like this and this, but generally it's about 10% or so of students in 9th grade drop out just in that year. So pretty high dropout rate for just 1 year. And also you could start to see, like particularly in this year, a big decline in enrollment. But look what happens when we go to the next 7 years with the program online. Over those subsequent 7 years, only 4 black males dropped out of 9th grade. Now, so it's a huge reduction. Now, those of you with a sharp critical eye are going to notice, well, eventually, particularly in these out years, there was a big drop in enrollment. Are there some confounds from program endogenous attrition out of the school? That's an internal validity threat we want to engage directly. But this is, what we might think of as a first difference, pre-post treatment, suggestive of a big effect, but again, it could have been any number of other things that were going on. So we want an econometric design that's going to allow us to sort of push the causal validity of this a little further. So I'll talk about that intuitively, but for the sake of my fellow methods people in the room, I'll also show you an equation that gets at this. So we essentially present, basic reduced form difference in difference results with a specification like this, where we observe dropout counts at the school grade year level. We condition on school grade fixed effects, year fixed effects, and the key treatment indicator that turns on it becomes 1 instead of 0 if this is a school grade and year in which the program was active. And we also condition on some other controls like the natural log of enrollment. And there were a few cases where the counts were 0. Like, we're modeling natural log of dropout counts, but the log transformation is not defined when dropout counts are 0. Like many people in the literature, we use a simple imputation to get around this, but we also show other ways of dealing with count data like this. And also it's possible in this model, I don't show it in the slide deck, but in the paper, we can also add year by grade and even school by year fixed effects to this model because the program varies by grade. So there's variation within Oakland Tech in 2011 because it was in grades 9 and 10 and not 11 and 12. Okay, so we worry about in terms of doing correct inference that there might be within group dependence, say within a school grade cell, so we adopt clustering for that, and I'll discuss some other inferential approaches. And we also allow the effects to vary by grade. And remember, I said the social psychologists really have, they make a big deal about things that are meant to buffer your social identity are most impactful when they hit you at that propitious moment when you're new in the setting. So social psychology would predict this program is going to be uniquely effective in 9th grade. When you're in this new school, your sense of belongingness and identity, et cetera, is uncertain in that space. It's likely to have most effect there. And if you look at the social psych experimental studies, they always try to get in the school at the beginning of the school year for that reason. So I'm going to show you effects by grade, but actually it's kind of under-identified with other possible dynamic effects, like an initial effect that might decay over time, or there may be dosage effects from having it 1 year and then another year. We show you that cut different ways in the paper. I won't show it here. I have it in some appendix slides. But a lot of it's kind of under-identified because the way the program rolled out, it was often in 9th grade first and then a couple years later in 10th grade. So the effect of being 1 year from initial exposure is often highly collinear with the effect of getting a second year of the program. So we can't really separate sort of different ways of conceptualizing dynamic treatment effects. One other set of wonky method notes before I show you the results. One of our key falsification exercises is to put log enrollment on the left-hand side of that equation and see, does the presence of this program seem to influence the enrollment of black males? If it does, it's a threat to internal validity because it suggests there might be some sorting into when and where the program is available based on things that we as researchers don't understand. Okay, so we examine that. Second thing we do to kind of interrogate internal validity here is to look to the data on black females. And we might do that, there's really two reasons to do that. One, targeted universalism suggests, and just common sense, that there might be spillover effects there. But also, if we're more empirically conservative, we might think that effects for black females reflect some of those unobserved things we can't control for. So for example, if a principal is just very equity-minded, and that's why they bring the program online, but what's really happening is they're doing 5 other things. Those 5 other things are likely to benefit black females as well. So that gives us a kind of control condition within a school grade and year. And more formally, we kind of stack this. I'll show you what's commonly referred to in the literature as a triple diff specification, the difference in differences that leverages that as a conservative kind of control condition. Another wonky methodological note, there's a growing recognition in applied research that panel-based designs like this often have a tacit weighting that could be misleading. Basic diff and diff estimators weight by the conditional variance in treatment, and so it tends to upweight observations that adopt treatment in the middle of the sample window. There's some emerging techniques for reweighting to recover the average treatment effect and to test the equivalence of unweighted versus weighted estimators. We show that and find that we can't reject the null that they're the same. So that kind of treatment heterogeneity doesn't appear to be an issue here. We also look at different ways of treating count data. There's a newly popular type of transformation called the inverse hyperbolic sine. And there are also maximum likelihood models specifically designed for count data, negative binomial and Poisson regressions. We also try to correct for the potential for finite sample bias in the clustering adjustment. We have very few clusters, and so that could lead us to overstate statistical precision. We use a technique from Pustojowski and Tipton. We also look at results weighted by enrollment. And finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about a newly popular approach called randomization inference. So most of that is pushed to the appendix, though, And we could circle back as there's discussion interests. But this is just to give you a flavor of what the triple diff specification looks like. And again, we could think of this as a way to address omitted variable bias. If we assume the effects of the program availability for black female students reflect other unobserved determinants, right? We could basically instantiate that in this type of econometric specification, where we've got unrestricted fixed effects for all the different two-way interactions. School grade by year, right? So this is like a dummy variable specific to Oakland Tech 2011 grade 9, gets its own dummy variable. We can still identify a treatment effect because we have black male and black female data there. And we define the treatment indicator as turned on for 1 instead of 0 if in that school grade year cell, this is the black male observation, not the black female. So there's within variation to leverage. And school grade by gender, gender by year, fixed effects, and this treatment indicator is that three-way interaction. You're in a school grade, in a year, and with the right gender for whom the program is salient. Okay, so some descriptive stats. Typically we see about 3 dropouts out of enrollment of roughly 49 students, roughly similar data for the black females. Around 17% of these cells over this window have the AMA available, and it's particularly prominent in 9th grade, to a lesser extent 10th grade, and much less common in grades 11 and 12. Okay, what do we see in terms of a basic diff and diff estimate? Negative 0.559. So this is where the dependent variable is the log dropout rate. So this implies, roughly a 43% reduction in dropout counts, which sounds ridiculously implausible. But I'll come back. It's actually more, it's because the dropout counts are so low, right, that you could see sort of large percent change, right? I want to say a little bit about another way of checking inference for this. Most classical statistical inference relies on the assumption that these are data drawn from some large hypothesized population. But there's a growing recognition, particularly driven by experimentalists, that's often not so. I think that's a uniquely relevant concern in settings like this. In what sense are these data drawn from a larger population? This is a universe of the data. So an alternative way to think about inference is instead to construct a distribution by randomizing schools and grades to having treatment status. So the basic idea is to, within every school grade cell, randomly assign them having treatment or not, estimate the impact, and then do that 10,000 times. And you should get a distribution of kind of fake impact estimates that you would expect in a world where the treatment had no effect whatsoever. That's a null distribution of estimated effects. And so that's what you get when you do that with these data. This is just randomly assigning treatment status, estimating the impact, doing it 10,000 times, mapping out that distribution. So randomization inference would then say, okay, now compare this null distribution of impact estimates in a world where there should be no impact to this distribution, our point estimates out here. With 10,000 replications, we never once saw an effect that was as big as this one. So it implies a small p-value, and econometricians, much smarter than I, think this approach has a number of compelling empirical properties. I just like it conceptually, because I think the way it thinks about inference really comports with the data construction we have. Okay, so let's go back through the results here. Now when we look by grade, we see these effects are really much larger in 9th grade, smaller, still significant in 10th grade, similarly sized but imprecise in 11 or 12. In this, we can't reject the common treatment effect, but if we saturated with a few other fixed effects, we could. But even casually, the effects are really concentrated in 9th grade. Okay, well, what about for black females? What do we see? We essentially see the same pattern, but much smaller. Right? There's evidence of a more modest reduction in dropout counts for black females when the program becomes available. And interestingly, it's again concentrated in 9th grade. So what the triple diff, the diff and diff and diff, does is it tacitly assumes all of this is omitted variable bias and subtracts this off to get conservative estimates, what I would think of as conservative estimates like this, which still imply like a 19% reduction in dropout counts among black males. And again, notice all the sort of richly interacted, unrestricted fixed effects we're conditioning on here. So these are the main results. They're robust to all those robustness checks I went through. And let me particularly show you what happens when we look at enrollment counts. In that same table, nothing but null results across all those different specifications. So changes in enrollment, potential endogenous selection out of the cells doesn't appear to be a problem here. Okay, so those are the main results. Let me talk about summarizing the evidence and interpreting it, and then sort of open up to questions. So basically we find the AMA appeared to reduce event dropout counts by about 43%. And here's how we get that approximation from the semilog specification. So in terms of thinking about effect sizes, in the average school grade year cell at baseline prior to the AMA, there were about 61 black males and 5.2 of them would drop out. So a 43% reduction, which sounds implausible, really means they move from 5.2 to 3.0 kids dropping out. And it's perhaps more natural to interpret this in terms of high school completion. And so we do a rough simulation that argues that AMA access in grades 9 and 10 basically implies improving high school completion probabilities by 3 percentage points, from say 69% to 72% would be in the right range for these kids. You know, the fact that there were some suggestive but imprecise estimates of impact in grades 11 and 12 suggested to me, and that's often where dropout counts are much higher, the program impact could perhaps be amplified by extending their reach into later grades. That's some of the formative feedback I gave to folks running the program. We also see some evidence of spillover benefits for black females, reducing dropout counts by about 29%. And I also want to stress, often a concern for policymakers is cost effectiveness. But remember, I argued much of what the AMA does is a reallocation of resources. The money in administrative overhead and some outside conferences and field trips is pretty modest. And to put this into comparison, there's a prominent recent article, experimental study published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics of a program called Becoming a Man. And the Becoming a Man program was evaluated in Chicago public schools. And basically it's a cognitive behavioral therapy program where they would pull kids out of class and have them in a small group where they would do exercises like give a ball to one kid and tell another, take that ball from him. And then of course they would start fighting and they would stop them and say, why didn't you ask him for the ball? Right? That's the kind of thing that goes on in cognitive behavioral therapy, and get them to rethink their patterns of engagement with others. Well, that program has shown almost the exact same impact as what I'm finding here, an improvement in high school completion of about 3 percentage points. But pullouts with small groups, it costs about $4,000 per student. So it's a pretty expensive program too. It's still a wonderful program, but I think there's something appealing about not just thinking about add-ons and pullouts, but are there ways to reconstitute the everyday operations of schools that meet the needs of the kids we're trying to serve. So I'll just conclude with some broader implications. First, I think this is more leading quasi-experimental evidence on the potential impact of targeted culturally relevant supports. And unlike the ethnic studies work, this is at least at some scale across the district. And I think of this as providing a nice complement to the corpus of kind of ethnographic evidence that's talked about practices like this. And a second sort of big takeaway point is, some evidence that, we now have 2 studies that suggest educational practices that work to buffer and affirm social identities clearly merit further scrutiny, right, by both practitioners and researchers, and I hope that will occur. But I want to conclude with a standard kind of cautionary note that, as with most policy innovations, whether we can replicate the success elsewhere is going to depend on our capacity to promote high fidelity implementation and do so at scale, and also to ensure some political durability for these programs that I think is often far too rare. I think there are going to be opportunities to do this, though, because I think, I mentioned My Brother's Keepers programs are ongoing in 250 communities. I don't know of other studies of them yet, but I do know that Chris Chapman has been working with multiple other school districts to implement this program. So there are going to be opportunities to study it elsewhere. And in fact, in a couple weeks, I'm going to be on a panel with the superintendent of Seattle Public Schools and Chris Chapman to discuss their efforts in taking this on. So there are going to be more learning opportunities, and I'm seeing great promise here, but it's early evidence. So thank you, and I look forward to our conversation. Thank you, folks. So I'll open the floor to questions, and I'll do my best with the light in my eye. If you feel you'd like to ask something, I think we may have microphones, or just feel free to say howdy in that loud voice I heard earlier.
Sir,
Yes.
are there any other programs like this for Latino students?
Yeah, that's a great question. Oakland has introduced one. I don't know of others that may exist. There may be, but so I think there's a considerable scope to learn. The challenge with doing that is always the people who run and introduce programs like this do this because of their programmatic fervor about changing lives. And God bless them, they're doing the Lord's work. Right? But I wish they could often sort of, as they roll out programs like this, have an eye towards assessment as well. And I think my sense is in talking with practitioners, so many of them, to put their feet on the floor in the morning, they have to believe what they're doing matters. And so they're not necessarily interested in talking to people like me who want to say, let's engage in some really critical assessment about, is it really working? That kind of humility and agnosticism about what works and what doesn't is lamentably rare, and I think that's a real impediment to kind of evidence-based programmatic improvement. There is a movement, particularly in education, largely spearheaded by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, to push for what's called a continuous improvement mindset, and I think that's an important movement. Trying to get people to think about inquiry cycles, where we're going to make this first effort, it's going to be our 1.0 moment, we're going to be ambitious, lean forward, fail, learn, try again, adapt, continue assessing. But the reality is, for many programs, they live in such a politically untenable environment that often they don't get that space to breathe and grow and adapt and improve. I think that's a real problem. So programs may come up, but will we allow them to realize their potential is an open question. Any other questions? Yes, please.
These kids come to your school preloaded with attitudes and hopes and expectations which may not be very high. Now, when you change the attitudes of these kids, how do these parents respond? How can you get help from these parents?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think because we know parental engagement, which is kind of an amorphous concept, very multidimensional, multifaceted, is hugely important. Like if you look at variance decompositions of school achievement, a large fraction of what drives student achievement is driven by schools. A larger fraction occurs outside of schools. No, and so the AMA doesn't really do all that much on parental engagement. They do invite the parents to some of the events, celebrating the kids, some of the leadership and activities. Like Chris Chapman was he was galled by the fact that there were kids in Oakland Unified who were getting perfect scores on state assessments to nothing but crickets. Like they never stopped to pause and celebrate that. So there were some modest efforts to do that, but not enough. And I wouldn't draw an invidious comparison between this and parental engagement activities. I think there's scope there, but this program isn't really about that. The thing sometimes this comes up in ed policy debates because people will say, there's so much focus on improving schools when a substantial fraction of the variation in student success is driven by factors outside of school. So I think that's true, but I sometimes I have a colleague where we joke about the walking and chewing gum theory of educational reform. We don't have to choose between one and the other, right? We can think of promising strategies for parental engagement as well as strategies that focus on schools. And you sometimes get this criticism, particularly from my more progressive left-wing colleagues, that stop asking so much of schools. All this poverty and other kinds of problem rolls up to the schoolhouse door, into the classroom, and you ask them to fix it. I'm sympathetic to that, but I would also argue, tell me where else in the social sector we get sustained 8 hours of contact over 180 days with kids. I mean, teachers are on the front lines of that. So yeah, we shouldn't make unreasonable demands of them, but we should also recognize schools have affordances for supporting student development that almost no other sector has, right? You know, we're also vexed with measuring in-school outcomes by the fact that our dropout results imply a selection problem, right? This program is keeping kids in school who otherwise would not be there. And so then when we start focusing on just in-school measurement, the counterfactual condition isn't quite balanced in terms of who's there to be measured. But you're right, it's important. That's one important caveat of this study is the narrowness of this result. I mean, dropout is a hugely important outcome. There's one prominent economic paper, and economists aren't typically prone to this type of hyperbole, but there's one prominent paper that says dropping out of high school is an economic death sentence. And I think that there's good evidence to support that. So I think these results are meaningful, but far from the kind of exhaustive set of outcomes we'd want. So, thank you.
So I guess I'm sitting here wondering, how do you get this study through IRB? I mean, it seems to be a population that has elements that they would consider discriminatory, that you're treating African American males but not females, not other ethnic groups. How do you survive that sort of thing?
Yeah, well, fortunately, it's a great question, and it's funny. Professors sometimes joke that IRBs are like snowflakes, like no one institution's IRB is like another's. But we're in a situation here because where the IRB oversight wasn't onerous because we were looking at secondary data. We didn't introduce this program. We were looking in the rearview mirror of what they introduced. So I think for them, the salient oversight wasn't IRB, but rather it was the state saying, you ever hear of Title IX? Right? Or do you ever, the other constitutional protections that are meant to support equal treatment? And so I think this is why, the district quickly moved to develop similar targeted universalist programs for other subgroups. And I think we might legitimately worry about if this kind of programmatic movement continues to grow, to what extent will that continue? I think it will raise sort of some normative concerns in a constitutional sense with which people are going to have to engage. And if people do it experimentally, IRB may try to hold them to account for that early on. So I think we're out of time, and Lori, we're going to make...
I think we're out of time.
Okay.
And we are so incredibly grateful. So, will everyone please just join me in thanking Professor D for an absolutely amazing presentation. We can't truly thank you enough, but we're going to try and give you a little bit of bling so you won't forget about us.
Excellent.
So,
wonderful.
Presents from the Bush School, logo on everything. So, but thank you very much for being here. Yeah. It's been a great honor, a pleasure. And thank you all for being here. I hope you will join us at future education policy workshops and have as much joy out of these as those of us who are in the school and in the studies do. So thank you all for coming. Drive carefully and come back soon. Bye.
Thank you, folks. Thank you, Larry. It's lovely.